Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à l'Autorité. Nous sommes réunis ce matin pour le troisième événement à échelle que nous organisons plutôt sur les sujets numériques et les nouvelles questions de concurrence. Donc je vais dire quelques mots en français, mais bien sûr l'échange avec Philippe Marsden va se faire en anglais. Alors peut-être quelques mots pour vous dire dans quel cadre se déroule cette présentation. Nous avons essayé pour ces rencontres informelles à l'autorité de choisir des thèmes nouveaux et de présenter au public français qui s'intéresse aux questions de concurrence les réflexions en cours qui font des propositions pour modifier le droit de la concurrence. Nous avons eu avant l'été une rencontre consacrée au thème de la blockchain avec Laure de la Rodière et le professeur Schreppel. Nous avons eu une rencontre sur le rapport des trois conseillers à la Commission européenne sur les questions numériques, qui nous a permis notamment d'approfondir plus particulièrement les questions des liens entre données et concurrence. Et donc nous avons le grand privilège d'accueillir aujourd'hui Philippe Marsden, qui est l'un des 5 auteurs du rapport dit rapport Furman, sachant que Jason Furman était l'un des 5 auteurs de ce rapport, qui a fait, c'est un rapport qui a eu beaucoup de retentissement parce qu'il fait un diagnostic qui certes rejoint d'autres réflexions, mais qui est assez complet sur l'impact du développement des plateformes sur les problématiques de concurrence et qui fait des propositions assez innovantes, assez disruptive, on pourrait utiliser ce terme. Voilà. Et c'est l'intérêt de la venue de Philippe ce matin sera de comprendre pourquoi ces propositions ont été formulées et d'échanger sur la façon dont elles pourraient être mises en œuvre très concrètement dans les prochains mois. Alors, sur la façon dont ces réflexions peuvent concerner ensuite plus directement l'autorité française et le droit français de la concurrence. Nous sommes maintenant depuis 2 ans dans une réflexion assez active sur les adaptations à apporter au droit français de la concurrence. Nous avons fait un certain nombre de propositions au gouvernement qui sont actuellement en cours de discussion et qui pourraient trouver bientôt une traduction législative. Nous sommes aussi à présent en phase active de préparation de la transposition de la directive ICN+, qui apporte un certain nombre de modifications importantes, notamment, mais pas uniquement, sur l'économie numérique. Et maintenant, il y a aussi un troisième volet plus large qui est la réflexion sur l'adaptation de la mise en œuvre du droit de la concurrence, peut-être avec des développements législatifs au niveau soit français, soit européen, peut-être de nouvelles formes de mise en œuvre du droit de la concurrence, notamment dans le domaine du contrôle des concentrations, qui a fait l'objet de beaucoup de débats sur la façon dont il faudrait apprécier les opérations de concentration, par exemple en termes de dynamique du marché ou d'appréciation de la concurrence potentielle. Aussi sur la thématique des acquisitions prédatrices, les killer acquisitions qui font l'objet d'un certain nombre de débats. Et aussi, et c'est un petit peu dans cet esprit que s'inscrit le rapport Furman, dans le développement d'autres formes de régulation, soit une régulation concurrentielle un peu plus ex-ante, qui reposerait sur des règles préalablement discuté avec les grandes entreprises, donc c'est l'une des propositions fortes du rapport Furman, soit aussi avec des instruments de régulation plus classiques, qui pourraient être des régulations européennes, qui porteraient par exemple sur l'accès à certaines données. Donc c'est dans ce panorama que se situent ces réflexions, et je peux vous annoncer d'ores et déjà que nous aurons 2 autres rencontres qui sont prévues en octobre et en novembre. Le 2 octobre avec le gouverneur de la Banque de France, M. Villeroy de Galhau, sur le thème de la finance et des acteurs numériques. Donc ça s'inscrit dans un travail de réflexion que l'autorité va lancer dans les prochaines semaines sur les modifications induites par l'entrée de grands acteurs de la tech dans le marché des systèmes de paiement d'une part, et dans la réflexion sur les modifications induites par les technologies de la blockchain, notamment sur les nouvelles monnaies et les cryptocurrencies. Une autre rencontre se déroulera, elle, en novembre, puisque le secrétaire d'État au numérique, Cédric O, viendra à l'autorité fin novembre pour nous présenter ses réflexions. Alors, je vais maintenant passer la parole à Philippe. Donc, peut-être pour vous dire quelques mots de Philippe Marsden, pour ceux qui ne le connaîtraient pas. Philip Marsden is a very distinguished competition professor, and he's among the most respected and valued experts in the field. And he has, over the years, done extensive cooperation and international work in spreading the word of competition across jurisdictions, but also, which is something very particular, has been a very active enforcer at the same time. He has had high responsibilities at the Bank of England, but also within the OFT and the CMA, and has actively engaged in cases in different responsibilities. So that makes a different kind of academic when you have actually tried to do the work of the enforcer. I think that this dual perspective really gives him a very authorized view on how to change competition law. So the idea is to have Philip present the report for those who haven't read it, and also to give his input on why the report was maybe asked of the experts, and how they have worked, and also what are the main feedback we can have about this report. And then with Henri Pifot, Vice-Président de l'Autorité, we will ask him a few questions, and of course engage with the audience, and feel free to interrupt and ask a question at whatever time if something is not perfectly clear. But I'm sure that Philip will make his views known very clearly. So Philip, the floor is to you, and thanks again for being here at the authority at this very early date in September.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. It's an honor to be here. I've had the pleasure of visiting many authorities around the world. Some are extremely efficient at coming at the wrong decision. I've worked at authorities that are extremely inefficient but come to the right decision. And now today I'm visiting an authority that I think is extremely efficient and comes to the right decision. Some of you may disagree with that, but I think it's true. We see what the courts will say, though, always. So I mentioned that because we're all friends here. It's a competition sort of community. And yet, as you know, there is a lot of populist debate, populist anger, resistance to the digital platforms. A lot of concerns about online harms, about fake news, capture of our politicians, of democracy, all sorts of things. And as a result of these pressures, there have been various movements to do something more about the platforms. Now, in some ways, sometimes some of the critics of the big platforms are also criticizing competition authorities, because the platforms could only exert the kind of influence that they have if they have essentially market power. And so one of the arguments is that the competition authorities, even as busy as this one is here, have been asleep at the wheel, or their substantive standards of assessment, particularly the consumer welfare standard focused on static price effects, has allowed enough of acquisitions and conduct that shouldn't be allowed. All right? And so because of this, there's been a sort of a narrative that we should leave competition law, we should leave consumer welfare standards, we should leave economic evidence, we should definitely leave away all the economists, and we should just take back control. We should take back control of these platforms. We're the daddy, we're the mummy, we're in charge of them, they're the babies, they're in our world, and we should just regulate them, we should break them up, we should cap their prices, cap their abilities, those kinds of things. And it's a very strong political movement, as you know. And I wouldn't discount the strength of this movement. And so we've seen, for example, in some countries, prohibitions on Amazon and Walmart from selling their own products on their own platforms, which to me is only price raising to the middle class and is only protection for the incumbent that wasn't as able as Amazon. Okay? We've seen some countries trying to stretch their competition law. They may not have merger control powers. They don't have merger control powers, but nevertheless they call in digital mergers and say we want to review this, and we try to extract some commitments. Okay? And we've seen stronger urges for something even more. So this Leave campaign is growing in strength. Now, unsurprisingly, on the other side of the debate, there is something called the Remain campaign, which is essentially from the technical advisors and the tech companies themselves who say, nothing to look at here. Move along. Markets tip, then they tip again. How many blackberries in the room right now? Not even one blackberry? Okay, you get the point, okay? And so markets tip, this is just Schumpeterian competition. We just move along, okay? There's no triangle of harm here. And by the way, be grateful for the innovation. Okay? We spend a lot of our times, like that, massaging a piece of glass. That's quite cool, isn't it? That we can get such information from rubbing a piece of glass. Isn't that interesting? It's amazing what we can do. All right, and another point about the Remain campaign is to say, from the competition authority's point of view, look, don't regulate, don't ban platforms from selling their own products on their own platform, that kind of thing. Just give us some more money. We'll do the cases using the same leveraging theories of harm, exclusionary theories of harm, exploitative theories of harm. Maybe we'll expand the concept of exploitation, right, from just not just excessive pricing, but to something else, right? But do not change the consumer welfare standard. Do not throw away economics. Just, you know, allow us to do our jobs a bit better, you know, and get out of the way, okay? So that's two polarized debates, Leave and Remain, you know, and we were asked by the Chancellor at the time, he's not even a Tory member of Parliament anymore, but he was the Chancellor at the time, Philip Hammond, to have a look at these debates and try to come forward with something that would contribute to the discussion. There's just so much heat in these debates and no light. And equally, a lot of the adversarial discussions and debates on conferences, but also in the courts and in investigations, doesn't necessarily allow a lot of learning. It's a lot of, you know, adversarial, you know, competition is a click away versus, oh no, you're terrible people. You know, the platforms are run by creeps. So neither of these arguments will ever meet. So the Chancellor commissioned us. Jason Furman, a renowned macroeconomist, led our panel. Professor Amelia Fletcher, who is on the CMA board, Professor Diane Coyle, who is also from the Competition Commission before the CMA, Professor Derek Macaulay, who is an IT expert and really good on algorithms and on portability of data, and myself. And we took this little selfie here, which is the only picture of our group, because we had a few words to say about the judges, and I don't know if we'll ever be invited back again. So that is our one picture of us with the Competition Appeal Tribunal sign. So these are the questions, obviously, you can see. You know, what are the competition issues? Can our laws cope? If not, should we make some changes, you know, or do we need more? Okay? All right, so those are the kinds of things that we were asked to explore. That was in October. We were given a few months, so only 6 months. We had a secretariat provided by the Treasury, the CMA, by the Communications Department, etc., and the Business Department. And we came up with a range of recommendations. And our most powerful recommendation, which I will probably get to at the end, was the need for a new regulatory model to create a digital markets unit within government to promote competition and innovation. But we also had some changes, which I'll discuss with you, about competition law, to reset merger control and to speed up antitrust cases that are particularly focused on the UK, but they might have some resonance for other countries. I'm not so sure about some of the speeding up antitrust cases recommendations for France, because you're pretty quick, but we definitely think that more needs to be done in the UK. And also we think that clearly my little island, which is currently, or has been for 3 years, going completely insane, which is off your coastline, that can't do anything by itself against these big tech giants, right? And so we need to have an international discussion, international coherent approach to understand more about what's going on. But first, some evidence, okay? So just so no one can criticize me, I have one slide about the benefits, okay? And it's a pretty busy slide, all right? So you've all got it. Take a photo of it. He talked about the benefits, all right? Right? There's tons of benefits, right? We all know about this. I've talked about the fact that we can massage a stone and things come out. I mean, it's amazing. And it's like a genie, okay, out of a bottle. We clearly are getting more choice. We're getting free products, and I'll come back to that. We get a range of abilities through the algorithms and through the data sets to assess markets that we never could. And plus, suppliers have platforms that they never could have reached. So small hotels near Chamonix or something can make sure that they get customers from Australia, you know, if they want, through a booking website. Or small suppliers can get on Amazon or another platform. So there's a range of things that are beneficial, definitely, in terms of accessing markets and choice. So there's no question. Advertising, whatever you think about it, and a lot of countries are examining the advertising market. Nevertheless, advertising is supposedly more targeted now. That can be quite creepy and quite annoying for many of us, but supposedly it's more targeted, which is perhaps a benefit in some way. And there's lots of innovation. There's no question that these companies are innovative, and a lot of the innovation is driven actually by the giants. They have the budgets, and they can do these Project X's, SpaceX, whatever. They can do really interesting innovation, very good. Plus the natural motive to invent something, but not necessarily become the world dominant leader, but just invent something cool and then sell out and get the money and invent again. This kind of thing is part of the venture capital model, is part of the model of many inventors. It's not the case necessarily that everybody in a garage wants to be the next Google. They just want to invent something cool, and then maybe Google will buy them. That's not necessarily a negative thing. There can be some negatives, which I will, of course, talk about. But there's a range of things where really interesting products can come to market faster. And also the tech giants as well have the budgets to focus on resilience, to focus on making sure their systems work properly. And indeed, if the regulators wanted to make them change some of their conduct, and we do have the power as the government to make them change their conduct, the conduct would change very rapidly. Okay, and throughout the society, if we got the tech giants to adhere to some new regulatory models, and especially if they were involved with some of that, which I'll talk about as well. Okay, so there's some challenges as well, okay, with digital platforms, which is more familiar to us in the competition world. Clearly, these are just, in a way, structural challenges focused on the nature of these markets. Okay, almost everything is going digital these days. So it's very difficult to determine what is digital and what is not. But with digital markets, we clearly have trans-global economies of scale and scope. We have a range of investment in brand reputation, customer-supplier relationships that we couldn't have before. Clearly there's network effects in these cases. Clearly data is important. There's no question that data is important, right? Otherwise, why would they spend so much money on the data? Yes, the engineers are important too. We'll talk about them, but the data is crucial. Okay, and also there is a demand side here where, sorry, I mean everybody in this room I'm sure works very hard, but we're lazy and we're selfish as human beings, okay? We don't want to spend, 10 hours reading terms and contracts. I think that means actually rational that we don't want to read terms and conditions in some contract for that amount of time, but we want to focus on what we want to do. We want to either enforce the law or defend against the law or go see our kids or whatever. We don't want to spend all our time mucking about. And so these behavioral biases mean that we're not as careful, I think, as we could be in some other markets when we're dealing with the digital space. Plus, we single home, for example. I was deputy chair of the banking investigation in the UK, which we'll probably talk about a bit later. And after 2 years of investigating these banks and working out that they were extraordinarily lazy, even only after 2 years, only then did I begin multi-banking, okay? And only with one other bank, right? So it's a natural human bias to say it's more efficient, let's single home, these kinds of things. Plus, the final bullet on the slide is there can be some anti-competitive behavior, as well. But the majority of these challenges actually are structural features of the market, which means that in a way, one of my themes will be competition law can't handle all of those things. Okay, that something else has to be able to be done to handle some of those issues. So, if you look at some of the evidence base, you see that whether it's in search, whether it's in mobile operating systems, whether it's in digital advertising, or whether it's in social media, you're looking essentially at duopolistic markets, or in fact, if anything, completely dominated markets with maybe a little bit of competition at the fringe, okay, which may not necessarily be exerting a competitive constraint. So you're definitely seeing a degree that of duopolistic conduct or even monopolistic conduct that is quite unusual, and we haven't really seen before, except in historical terms in years ago when actually the remedy was to break these companies up, when you saw that kind of concentration. Okay? Even Facebook admits, and this is one of its own slides, that there's a degree of overlapping usage amongst its apps. There's multi-homing, but of course as the app or as the technological platform leverages into other areas, you start becoming more and more beholden or more and more dependent in a way, and perhaps for good reasons, dependent on that technology, dependent on that platform, and gaining the benefits that I mentioned. But indeed, in the other side of the dependency is that you're not considering perhaps other options, or you're not able to consider other options. And this is just something that could be natural. It could be just part of a natural extension of superior skill, superior foresight, superior industry of the tech platforms, or it could be something else. Okay? Now, there was some American research about 30, 40 years ago that looked at this. So not all of these issues are that new. And I have to mention that this kind of research is something which we find in many, many papers, but I'll just repeat it once here. And be careful about this, this quote. It's a literal quote. Mirrors on the ceiling, pink champagne on ice, and she said, "We are all just prisoners here of our own device." Relax, said the night man. We are programmed to receive. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. And that was essentially the point of the slide I showed you before about Facebook, okay? So one of these issues here is that there is a degree to which we are given more choice because of these platforms, but in some ways we're given less choice, and sometimes we don't even know it. So you will know the old joke that when people say, oh, I don't use Facebook anymore, you can find me on Instagram. Okay, all right, and, and are people really aware of this? So okay. So it's just something to be thinking about. There is a curated choice there, but also there's areas we don't even know that our choice is being curated or limited. So we came back and we said, look, we think there is some harm to consumer welfare, especially through harms to the innovation that could be possible. Okay, there's a lot of innovation, but we think there are counterfactuals out there that are even better. Okay? And we think that our own consumer welfare test should be kept, so we are remainers in that regard, but that it should be extended through a long-run, multi-dimensional focus on quality and non-price effects. Okay? Many authorities are struggling with this and trying to implement this, but it's clearly the case that we can't just focus on direct price effects to consumers, because that is not necessarily relevant in these markets when you have a zero-price, free price market. Nevertheless, we're not very good at assessing where the payment's coming. Like, follow the money, which means follow the data. There are payments happening, or payments that should be happening, like that, via data and via attention. And there's something there that I think the model could be improved on. There's clearly an opportunity for indirect harm to business users, where they are charged too much to advertise or charged too much to sit on a platform or to remain on a platform. And there's obviously charges for rankings and these sorts of things. There's also an opportunity for rankings to be skewed, and we've seen this in many cases relating to shopping and other cases relating to Google. Right, and there's also situations where, even though the firms that I'm talking about are quite innovative, there have been experiences where they've got quite lazy, actually. And that's the Microsoft Internet Explorer example, where once they had essentially a monopoly in that aspect of competition, like that, they retasked engineers for 5 years away from Internet Explorer. Okay, and that meant that they didn't update the app, for want of a better word, and Firefox came along and ate their lunch. Right? And so that's something where humans made a decision: we don't need to innovate, we're the best. And then they therefore fell behind. So there's something in there about some harms that can be happening relating to incentives to innovate. The standard lazy monopolist argument. We weren't able to consider the role of enhanced political power, online harms, resilience risks. I'm quite concerned these days about resilience risks in the cloud. We can talk about that if you like as well, because it relates to this, because cloud is quite concentrated. But it's something where we do feel that there are harms out there that we need to look at. So, is it the case that in these markets, digital markets, market tipping and leverage is inevitable? Well, of course, we've got a lot of Swedish research in this regard. There's no question that this definitely is happening. I think our report should have been called The Winner Takes It All, but I didn't win that battle, probably for very good reasons. Yes. Okay, market tipping and leverage is inevitable. Okay, yes, these markets are defined by network effects, scale economies. Data is very useful. There we have these demand-side biases. In other words, we're lazy and intentionally, in a sense, and rationally lazy, because we can't keep up with every development. But there could also be some anti-competitive activity, and we've seen that. Okay. So the president mentioned the killer acquisitions, these acqui-hires, acquisitions of people, which flow under the radar of the competition authorities, but nevertheless could be having some negative effects, as well as benefits. Okay, but it means we need to assess these a bit more carefully. There are moves to limit multi-homing. So even when consumers and suppliers want to multi-home, they actually wake up and decide to be more engaged. There are definitely incentives there within the big platforms to make sure you don't multi-home, and we've seen that through most favored nation clauses, etc. There's exclusivity arrangements relating to the use of data, or exclusivity arrangements relating to which platform you're on. There's self-preferencing through Google Shopping. There's tying and bundling, as we've seen. And there's the arguments that Thibault and others have made about predatory innovation, which could be argued it could have been happening between Facebook and Snap. We'll see. So the question is, we have these theories of harm. We have these cases. So shall we just remain within competition law? Is that not enough? Let's just give the authority more money and more staff, and everything will be fine, like that. I definitely think that is part of the solution, okay? A big part of the solution. More resources for competition authorities. And I think that would benefit business as well, because businesses would be able to engage more with the authorities in a less adversarial way and actually allow the authorities to understand the incentives within the market, okay? But clearly there's something more that needs to be done. So we had some recommendations for merger law. We thought that we thought on balance, and we're 5 academic experts commissioned by the Treasury. We're not doing a 5-year study of all kill zone acquisitions that have been alleged, but we thought on balance, merger control has been under interventionist. There's areas of our thresholds for notification, there's areas for what triggers a concern for competition in some jurisdictions where occasionally a merger will fly under the threshold. So that means that hundreds of acquisitions have happened that haven't even been looked at. And all we're saying is let's just change the dial a little bit and look a little bit more at some of those transactions. The sky will not fall in. The venture capital will not dry up. Innovation in a garage will not stop if we look a little bit more at some of these transactions, okay? And when you look at some of the money that's being paid for these acqui-hires, these 16 people with no turnover and an interesting website or something like that, it's kind of incredible when you look at this. Now, some people might say, well, the little innovator with 16 people is just driving a hard bargain against poor, weak Google and poor, weak Facebook, and they're able to extract billions and billions from them. Maybe. Maybe Google and Facebook have looked ahead and said, okay, we actually think that's the value of this company and we want to make sure we get it, and that's fine. And maybe it's all completely legitimate. All I'm saying is that when there's that much money on the table, can we just ask a few more questions? I'm not saying that overvaluation or overpaying for something is a problem. I'm not saying that. Maybe they're just stupid. I don't know. It's not my job to help them, okay? The issue is to find out, can we just scratch a little further? Can we see some contemporaneous board documents where you explain to your board that you're going to overpay by 2,000% for something and the board tolerated that? So clearly there must be some contemporaneous evidence of the benefits of the transaction from an efficiencies point of view or a strategic point of view. And if there isn't that evidence, that's interesting. That's all I'm saying. That's interesting. Can we look a little more? We're not saying at all that there's a theory of harm that you're overpaying, okay? So we said, look, a lot of these acqui-hires, these deals haven't been reviewed, or if they've been reviewed, they've been given a quick look, and maybe that makes sense. Maybe that's the right thing. But I think on the margins, we came down on the side of saying that there's been a few deals that should have been looked at. Even ones that have had phase 2 scrutiny have just sailed through. There's been the odd commitments case at phase 1, but really it's very odd that these deals go through, usually because of a strong entry story. And when you look at some of the retrospective work that the CMA has had done about these kinds of digital mergers, you look and say, well, actually, these entry stories, oh my gosh, Alibaba's coming. Well, we've heard this before. It used to be, oh my gosh, Google's coming, and oh my gosh, China's coming, and before then, oh my gosh, Japan is coming. These entry stories don't add up, okay? But because we are given a lot of evidence about entry, we tend to believe it because we don't have much on the other side. So as authorities, I think we have to be more disciplined and ask more questions about entry, okay? So it's very difficult to look back at these cases, and some of you will probably ask me later, okay, which deals did we miss? Like that, and we're just saying, on balance, it's implausible that some of those deals weren't problematic. It just doesn't seem to make any sense at all. Okay, so we have some recommendations. Let's prioritize scrutiny of digital mergers. A lot of authorities are already doing this, but some authorities don't have that ability yet, and we're saying that they need help as well to prioritize that scrutiny. Focus on harms to innovation, because clearly price isn't the main issue here. Focus on potential competition, as difficult as these are to assess with counterfactuals, but that should be the focus. We had a suggestion which was reasonably controversial, which is to replace the substantive merger test, which is about a substantial lessening of competition on a balance of probabilities. We said, look, isn't it more economically literate to have a balance of harms test, which is when you're looking at these acquisitions of these companies with no turnover or just a few employees, it's almost inconceivable that you would be able to prove on a balance of probabilities that this will lead to a substantial lessening of competition. Now, I'm not trying to change the test to make sure the CMA or the authorité wins more of these cases. I'm just saying that's not the right question to ask. In these cases, you should be asking, look at the likelihood and the degree of potential harm and assess that using your judgment, okay, and using your existing skills. And maybe on the margins, you might end up extracting a few more commitments from some firms. Maybe you might block one or two here. I don't know. It's not going to make the world fall apart, though, if you have a balance of harms test rather than a balance of probabilities test. And then we said, look, we need to reset some of the merger assessment guidelines. A lot of these were written in many countries before the rise of digital. And it's something where we need to make sure there's more clarity for business and for advisors, as well as for the enforcement staff, on how we assess the counterfactual and how we look at valuation and acquisition documents, those kinds of things. Okay? Now, we had some recommendations for antitrust cases. Now, a lot of people say, well, as I mentioned before, just give us more money, we'll just do the cases faster. Okay? And indeed, there are some authorities that say, we've got a prosecutorial model, don't worry about it, nothing to see here, move along, it's all the judge's fault, blah, blah, blah. Let us do more of the same and faster. And there are some authorities who say that we can indeed make antitrust great again just by enforcing our laws. And that's fair enough. That's a strong point that many people with American accents will make. And that's fair. Okay? The question I'm making is that the evidence base I set out earlier shows that antitrust is only a certain part of the solution, because there's other issues out there that are bigger than just antitrust adversarial litigation. Okay? So we had some recommendations for antitrust, which is we should ask some of the authorities, and I know you have limited budgets, but look back at the cases you didn't take. We saw evidence in our assessment and in our experience that difficult cases sometimes are deprioritized because they're just too difficult, or they're left to someone else, or it looks like it's going to be too long and there's going to be an inevitable appeal. Let's just try to find a quick fix, whatever. And this might all be fine, but it could also mean that some things are missed. All right. So let's have a look back a little bit at some of the cases that were not taken, some of the cases that were closed. Right. Definitely, and this is where we're learning from the French. Let's streamline the process of interim measures. In the UK, we actually have the ability to be almost as quick as you, and yet we're not. We do this sort of almost a full case examination before any injunctive relief, and even then we lose, it seems. And so it's just bizarre. And so we need to be getting ahead of these problems, and bringing injunctions more quickly. And we thought, on balance, that perhaps some of the judges perhaps had been a bit too clever by half in some of the cases, and perhaps they should just be judicially reviewing the reasonableness and sanity of our decision as at the CMA, at the authority, rather than a full merits appeal with 4 more weeks of hearings, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the CMA has also come out with something like that, but we felt actually it is the case that in some jurisdictions there has been a degree of judicial intervention that is perhaps unwarranted given the review of a specialist decision maker. And so we recommended a move to JR, Judicial Review Standard. And that's in a way also because, rightly so, I think competition officials are extremely humble and extremely careful, and they want to win in court. All right? But the thing is that if the court is extraordinarily scrutinizing of every T and every I, all right, it is the case then that the case teams will cross every T and every I, and cases will take 3 or 4 years, and then they'll still lose in court because they missed some punctuation somewhere, some semicolon was missing, like that, or the judges took a different view. So I'm not completely critical of the judges, but I don't think I'm going to be invited back to the tribunal anytime soon. Okay, so we have some recommendations for antitrust cases. We know that there's the old problems I've mentioned, leveraging exclusion, perhaps exploitation, these kinds of things, cliffing companies off the website, down the pages, these kinds of things. There's also new issues, and I'm currently very concerned about concentration in the cloud, and I'm also very concerned about this growing Internet of Things, where we are paying to bring this stuff into our homes so that we can shout at some machine about we need more toilet paper. I mean, it's just insane, or play Taylor Swift or whatever this nonsense is. So, of course, I'm over 50 years old, so I'm an old man, and so I would be conservative like this. But there's a degree of choice curation in an oral exchange where you're not even looking at a screen with 5 items. You're saying, buy me this, and then it's presented to you. I think there are aspects there where there are efficiencies, but there's also something where there's an opportunity to curate you. So we have situations here where we have of course, the research by Lou Bega. You'll know this paper very well, I'm sure. I will quote from it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, everyone in the hall come alive. A little bit of Alexa on all the time, a little bit of Echo in my life, a little bit of Sonos in the sun, a bit of HomePod all night long. And so what can I do, really, my Lord, I beg you? Because you can't run and you can't hide. They'll grow and grow until they touch the sky. That's why Margarita's on my mind. Now, Teresa's times in the sun is coming to an end. Brexit, let's dump it, set in the trumpet. Please get it in done. But a little bit of evidence and a lot of action makes me your man. All right? So that's antitrust. And I hope that that is tolerable. I didn't check the intellectual property laws about that photograph there. And you didn't approve it at all. It's completely denied. But action, more cases, more understanding of the markets, more resources for competition authorities, more data teams to be able to engage with the platforms and understand the models, more activity, okay? I don't need to say that in this building because you're the most active, but it's something that we said to the CMA. Okay, that's not enough though, we felt. It's not likely to solve all the problems, and here I'll come to the conclusion. Enforcement will still take a long time. You'll still have those battles. You still need to have those battles in a fair world with judicial review and due process. Okay, but the cases are very partial. They're very focused. They're very surgical, necessarily so. They're very careful in their assessments, okay? And the fines, it's all very nice to have a fine. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. We got some attention on a pink newspaper, 5 billion in fines or whatever. That's good. We get the attention, we get the deterrence, but it's not as deterrent as it needs to be. So some authorities can disqualify directors, more surgical focuses on that, that's good. But higher fines, do they necessarily answer anything? No, I think we need more tools. So remedies might be too narrow, they're not forward-looking enough. We have the horrible experience of Windows being designed without a media player. You know, this is rare, but it can happen. And they need monitoring, which means that more staff are needed to monitor things that are probably inevitably going to be, at some point, there's going to be some cheating, and so that needs to be monitoring. But primarily, because of the economic structure of these markets, we feel that more needs to be done to promote competition rather than just limit anti-competitive acts, okay? And so this is where we came forward with our main conclusion, which was the digital markets unit. So here we're saying, look, would it not be interesting for the authorities, the government, the communications ministry, etc., to get together with the big platforms and the big complainants, or the small complainants, the consumer groups, put them in a room, it may not be much bigger than this room, and you sit down together and you say, look, what are these issues? Okay, they are being litigated in the courts. In Germany and France, in the UK and the US, yes. But what are some of these issues? So then the platforms can explain in a non-adversarial method why they do self-preferencing, what the benefits of self-preferencing are, what the benefits of tweaking an algorithm are, why did this thing happen this way, those kinds of things. Why do they mandate increased engagement always? So if you leave a YouTube autoplay playing over and over, it gets more and more salacious and more interesting because we're lazy and we only want more interesting things. But what could happen there in terms of online harms or other things if you allow that engagement, that algorithm that constantly makes things more interesting? So something needs to be done there about that discussion. So we said, borrowing or stealing from Jean Tirole, let's have a participative regulation, participative antitrust, where you come into a room in a relatively collaborative setting and you say, look, we think there's a need for regulation of firms with what we call strategic market status. And by that I mean, and I'll expand a bit later, but essentially we're talking about economic dependency here. Now you and other jurisdictions have focus on economic dependency. The UK doesn't so much, but it's a situation here where you can intervene without a direct proof of consumer welfare harm in terms of price raising. You can focus on a reduction of choice. And so we thought that's more apt in this area. So let's draw up a code of conduct based on strategic market status, that firms with that status have to adhere to this ex ante. And let's clear the market of some of these really toxic practices, but at the same time, use that form to understand the business models behind it. So let's make sure that, rankings and reviews are provided on a fair, consistent, transparent basis. So there's motherhood and apple pie and everybody's happy, all that kind of stuff. High-level principles will be litigated, but try to get ahead of the problems, okay? Let's make sure there's no unfair restriction from certain platforms. But importantly, let's promote data portability. So it's not like I'm going to go back to the 60s or 70s and say we want a free, open ARPANET and we all will love and come together, and all this kind of stuff. No, I mean there's commercial powers behind these behind these markets, all right? But there's not an aspect to which I understand the need for a walled garden. The degree to which data is preserved and kept exclusively is really interesting in this area when the big firms say we don't need the data. The data's not interesting. Oh, really? Then why do you have so much of it, and why won't you send it off to one or two of your other intermediaries at a reasonable price? So there must be some aspect where we can introduce portability and interoperability, and we have some experience from the open banking work in the UK in that regard where we see some benefits from that. And so generally we're saying not release all your data through some giant fire hose that will drown the complainant. We're saying allow the complainant to access your data set, train its algorithms, those sorts of things, for a payment. But it's that kind of model where we improve some openness. Her Majesty's government, in all its wisdom on that crazy island, reviewed our proposals after March and supported them, and they're moving forward with the creation of a digital markets unit, so I'm very pleased that we landed that big idea. The CMA has been largely supportive. I had a couple of questions about our balance of harms test. I think the tribunal may have something to say at some point about our focus on what the judges should be doing. But the thing is that at least we've had some support, right? And what's been really interesting, hashtag antitrust tourism, is I've been able to go around the world this summer and get a very nice suntan talking to other countries who are also interested in this, who say actually we are getting this pressure to do more. And if you try to squeeze these pressures, sort of hipster pressures, into antitrust, the antitrust model breaks. We need something else that is a better model, and we think it's regulation in this regard. So look, if we bring these big boys and girls to the table, will they listen to us? We're the regulators. Do we know what to do? Will they sit politely and just do whatever we say? Well, I say that some of them actually have an interest in being regulated. I think definitely they have an interest in being regulated. It helps them get ahead of certain problems, helps them not be distracted. The lawyers in the room, yes, you can definitely defend them for the next 30 years in courts around the world, but it is a bit distracting from their business model to have to be tolerating all of these different actions around the world. So maybe they could get ahead of some problems. And also, I think that some of the problems are set up because these big companies, obviously they don't think about antitrust. What company does think about antitrust? What company thinks about fair competition? Really? They don't. And these companies are thinking about what's the best algorithm, what's the best way we can make money off this data. And some companies, of course, say, we're just here to delight consumers. And that might be true. They are indeed there to delight consumers, but it's the way they delight their consumers that can cause problems for competition. So I think there's a way that we can bring the regulators and the big firms together and have a supposedly beneficial, if not pleasurable, experience. So we are writing a code of conduct. I called it the Ride of the Valkyries there, but it's a code of conduct, a song sheet for the G-Mafia. I include I there because I think IBM and Intel also need to be looked at sometimes. And this would also apply to Baidu and Alibaba and Tencent, etc., as it should, to get ahead of the problem. So this is a song sheet that basically says we're going to control certain conduct ex ante, and if you want to play in this market, you have to abide by these rules. And of course, this will just complement antitrust. It won't replace antitrust. So what are we saying in the UK? It's a quintessentially British solution. We want an evidence-based change, and I've tried to lay out some of the evidence, and we want it after peer review, where there's a discussion with you about what is good in these proposals and what is crazy in these proposals, so we can find a dynamic answer to these problems. But we're not leaving, and we're not just going to sit still and remain. We definitely need a backstop, and why is that? Because those of you from Game of Thrones fans, winter is coming. You don't believe this. I mean, the Game of Thrones winter was rubbish. But the real winter, the regulatory winter that is coming in terms of regulating online harms, doing something to these companies, it can happen in some very important jurisdictions very quickly. that would really chill innovation, really harm the platforms. And we, as competition authorities and officials, don't want that. We want surgical intervention. We don't want to kill the patient. We want to cure the patient if we want. So we're saying we're not going to give up on the consumer welfare standard. We're going to stay within that model. We're going to stay within an international community of enforcers that's adding a little bit of pro-competitive regulation to these antitrust investigations and merger review, and we're going to stay together. We're not leaving in any way. We're going to stay together with this kind of hopefully beneficial debate that we'll have today about these suggestions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Philippe, for this very entertaining and fascinating presentation. So you succeeded to make a very lively summary of this report of more than 100 pages. So I think the audience will appreciate that. I will now leave the floor to Henry to try to ask you a few questions about how we compare this approach with, for example, the European Commission report. And after that, I think we'll try to discuss about how we can put into place or whether we want to do or follow this type of approach. So maybe Henry for the first question.
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm still in need of caffeine, but I think you brought a lot of energy to this morning. One thing which is striking is that there's very clearly a high demand in many countries and areas like the EU on what to do with the market power or perceived market power of digital platforms nowadays. And that has led to, as you say, a kind of stretch on antitrust. What should we do? I mean, is antitrust always the answer to that? One of the answers to kind of release the pressure has been for many of these authorities to ask for reports to be written. Yeah. You're one of the guilty ones. Yeah. At the Commission, there was a report which was asked to be produced by 3 special advisors, which was published in April this year, and then there was the Australian one and many others. What would be interesting to hear is how you see the differences between your own approach at within the Furman team and that, say, of the 3 special advisors in the EU, and perhaps also the Australian one, which is a very thick one.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, of course, as a part of my life being an academic, I would say that a competition of reports is good. Right, it's intellectually stimulating. We were commissioned by the Treasury. We're not part of the Competition and Markets Authority. We were given recommendations to the Competition and Markets Authority. So in some sense, we had a degree of independence of views. Nevertheless, in our report, we were consulting with the CMA and with the Industry Ministry, and there were some, what's the phrase, robust conversations. I think that's the British phrase for it, in the creation of our report. And I think indeed the European trio would have had similar robust conversations with probably some enforcers who say, just let us do the work and look at the European case law. We have tons of cases in this area. We'll just get a bit faster, or these kinds of things. And clearly that group there in Europe focused on reversing or changing some of the presumptions, some rebuttable presumptions. We didn't go that route. We were clearly focusing on more assessment, more engagement. So with the digital markets unit, more engagement with the digital platforms, all right, and to understand their business models and to regulate them. Okay, frankly, to call a spade a spade. I think that report was motivated more by sort of what improvements can we make to antitrust and merger control, and so we perhaps we had a broader remit. The Australians have come out with some amazing recommendations, which is really good. I would say though, and I would say this, wouldn't I? I think we have enough reports. I mean, with all respect to the FTC and their massive report they will do, let's get some action going, right? Let's get some discussions going. Let's get some of these meetings going. Let's keep the cases going. And the reports, even the Stigler report, is largely in parallel to ours. So there's a lot of common themes, but there are some specific little differences here and there at the margins. I think the Australians, for example, would say to us, well, we don't need to change the appeal standard for our courts, like the UK perhaps should, because they already did. Right? They got legislation to just change the appeal standard. So a very pragmatic Australian solution. So they don't need to have that recommendation. But I think it's time to get these discussions going, because every day where this dominance remains entrenched, is a day where there are increasing complaints and companies could be going out of business, consumers could be being harmed, and I think we need to start moving on to this sort of more active discussion and then action.
Maybe I have a question about this code of conduct that you propose, and which is a novel approach because it's not exactly ex-ante regulation applying to all and everyone. So among the new elements are the fact that you would apply this code of conduct only to a certain group of companies, and you chose not to define them as dominant companies, but to use this new concept. So maybe you can tell us about what were the other options when you try to define this concept? Because, for example, in France, we start thinking about systemic players or companies with who act as platforms and crucial intermediaries. So we hear a lot of different notions trying to grasp what is really at stake. And maybe if you can give us the feedback you had in the UK beyond the fact that the Chancellor of the really embraced your report about maybe from the companies, the tech companies, did they give their views during your discussion afterwards?
Very nice, yeah. No, well, we had a lot of hearings and a lot of engagement with the big platforms and with other entities. Indeed, there's been a lot of discussion in the UK about our focus on strategic market status. What does this mean? Why did we come at this approach? Why didn't we just choose dominance? Dominance, of course, is an economic concept. Some of my best friends are economists. No, I'll admit that. Okay, but market definition can take a year or two, then you have a year of arguments about dominance, and then finally you get to talk about the conduct. Right? And we think that in some of these areas, let's just get to the conduct. Okay, like that. And so we felt, let's just get to that. Let's by all means keep the long cases focused on market def and focused on dominance. By all means, abuse. Let's keep those cases. But in the meantime, for a certain select type of practices, like self-preferencing, like this kind of exclusion by algorithm tweak, these kinds of things, based on a theory of harm relating to economic dependency, that is probably a better focus, we thought, for us. And let me explain what I mean. Strategic market status to me means that clearly it's less than dominance. So a dominant firm would have strategic market status, but it can clearly apply to non-dominance. Let's say that I am a small supplier of something, pens, and I am rational, and I am profit maximizing. It would be irrational for me not to put some of my supply on Amazon. Okay? Now, I have lots of choices. I could go anywhere. I could just sell in my little shop, or I could sell on eBay or whatever. But it would not make a lot of sense for me to ignore one of the best platforms in the world for retail. Okay? That means that there is a degree of economic dependency there. Okay? It's nothing to sort of accuse Amazon with or anything like that. It's just a fact. They've been very successful, and therefore there is a degree to which, once they're on that platform, they could do things with that supplier that may not be ideal. And the same thing could apply to booking and these things. So we felt you've got strategic market status if there's a degree of economic dependency, and then immediately the criticism comes from many economists and lawyers, well, what does any of that mean? You've just given us a nice example, but we can think of lots of ways around that. And the point is to work with industry to help define that. Now, of course, the big platforms largely have welcomed that discussion about how to define whether or not they have strategic market status. So another alternative would have been just to name them. Right? And we do that in the UK with groceries, where we had the same kind of investigation of platforms, retail platforms. We found that, broadly speaking, they were competitive, these markets, in terms of no real consumer welfare harm in terms of that retail market back a few years ago. Nevertheless, we introduced a code of conduct for the retailers because they were having an impact on supply upstream. And we have an adjudicator who acts very quickly to determine whether this leveraging or these exclusions are happening. And indeed, what I found, and I think Andrea Coscelli, the head of the CMA, has agreed with this, is because of the existence of the adjudicator, even if she doesn't do any actual fining of the companies, but just her existence, his desk vanishes in terms of all of these complaints from the suppliers about complaints that wouldn't necessarily fall under competition law. Do something, please do something, my farm is going out of business. This kind of stuff is not necessarily part of competition law in the UK. We don't have an economic dependency standard. And so we felt, and so the UK ended up naming these platforms, right? And then you have a debate about, okay, why do you name them? What, is it $1 billion in sales, $1 billion in turnover? Is that makes you part of this list? That gives you certainty. You're on the list or you're not. Okay, I understand that. We chose not to do the naming because we felt it should be more dynamic, focused on their strategic market status. Google will definitely have strategic market status in some areas it won't. I think Netflix will have strategic market status in some areas, and in others it won't. And it's a dynamic standard, okay? So there definitely would be some assessment, some analysis, some monitoring of whether you're on the list or not on the list. But at least then you have had a discussion with the regulators about whether or not the list has been defined correctly. And then we can very rapidly see if you're adhering to the code of conduct. And my model for that would be a very fast adjudicative model. With paper-based adjudication based on the practices, the complainants. I would have it user-led. So we wouldn't just be regulating for the sake of it. We would be welcoming complaints, and then we would be pushing the complaints away or taking them forward. But at the same time, the digital markets unit would be learning, and at the same time also, when it identifies areas where markets have been closed, it will be trying to open them up as well through portability and interoperability. So it's that sort of situation where whether it's a systemic risk or not. I worry about the systemic risk or systemic status definition, because then you get into the situation which we've seen with the banks, that they're systemic, so they're too big to fail, which means they're too big to jail, right? And we need to jail some of these people, frankly. And so it's one of those situations where we need to act. And I worry once you get into systemic discussions, then very big other policy interests come along and say, don't touch that. Whereas we're just talking about strategic market status. It's within our little competition law box. We can work and develop those principles, I hope, relatively quickly.
Thank you. So I understand that on your view, a given company would be asked to participate in this exercise because they are strategic and they have a strategic market status, but on a given sector, for example, Google, this could be online advertising, but not necessarily groceries retail. And maybe to clarify how companies would engage in this code of conduct, would it be completely voluntary, or would it be a mandatory obligation to engage and to approve a code of conduct in this participative way?
Okay. Well, I think generally speaking, though, it doesn't seem to be the policy of our current Prime Minister. I should check the time. Is he still Prime Minister? It's better to be in the tent than outside the tent, right? I won't continue with the metaphor. And I think that the large platforms that we've been talking to have, for the most part, agreed that they should come to the table. Okay, it makes sense for them to come to the table. Now, a cynic might say, of course they want to come to the table to define strategic market status and define the code. Of course they do. But they genuinely, I think, recognize, especially their corporate compliance and policy officials within their entities, they recognize there are some benefits to them as well in terms of explaining it. So if they don't come to the table, the code will be written without them, so they'll be perhaps on the list without having any benefit of explaining to us their business model. So I think there's a natural incentive for them to engage, it's not the case that they'll be able to evade this. But it's something where, in a sense, our contribution to the international debate is to try out this participative model and to see if it works. We're still going to run the antitrust cases. We're still going to you can imagine, for example, we had another review that came out with its results 2 weeks before our review. It's called the Cairncross Review, relating to online harms. You could imagine a situation where that review would create a digital regulator, right, to focus on online harms and privacy and other issues, that is absent any discussion of the business incentives, right? And in that case, I think that could come down with some regulatory winter type of solutions that are not necessarily beneficial. So I would say let's build the digital markets unit and analysis into that kind of regulation, if that's the way it goes, so that we can understand these business models better and therefore not be over-interventionist. Remember, all we're saying, with my nice polite Canadian accent, is let's just change the needle a little bit, right? Now people then say, oh yeah, once you give him the power, he'll be whacking these firms, No. Trust me. But we're just saying, can we just look a bit more carefully? Can we just try to get ahead of some of the problems? Isn't that reasonable? Do we have to litigate everything? And that's all our report is really saying. Let's just be careful about this, be surgical about this. So when we get the criticisms, oh my gosh, your regulation, and oh my gosh, your socialism, and this is unbelievable, and you're overturning competition law. Another criticism we had is we're moving from an object approach to an effects-based approach. In competition law, we're looking at more economic analysis, And then Furman comes along and says, let's just have a bunch of per se prohibitions with no economic analysis whatsoever. You can do what you like as a regulator, you know? Well, of course we're not doing that. Of course not. Of course it's reasonable and evidence-based. Anyway. Come, talk.
Maybe at this point I will open the floor for questions or remarks on this part, maybe more specifically of the report, and then maybe we can go to the issue of data, mobility and portability. So is there any question or remark at this point?
See, everyone agrees.
They're lacking coffee, I think. They had to digest that of substance. So I see one hand and there. So, Madame, et après Etienne. If you can just say who you are, thank you.
Sophie Lepalec, I'm from GS1, which is a standard organization. So we help companies to standardize their data in order to share them. And I would like to thank you for this job, which is very instrumental for the economy. And I couldn't say much about merger and acquisition, which is not my part at all. But regarding interoperability and portability, I think the analysis that you're doing is crucial indeed. And we have to go much further into the comprehension of this phenomenon, economic phenomenon. Why are we stuck in the digital platform era now? That's the underlying issue is interoperability. We could consider that digital platforms are an anomaly because what is important, what they demonstrate to us, is that data concentration is crucial and can bring an extraordinary power. But the problem is that this data is concentrated into the hand of a few actors while it's been produced by the crowd. So the question is how to give the power of this data concentration back to the crowd. And interoperability data is very important, but we have to go further because interoperability is very vague. There are different levels of interoperability. And many players are playing with this vagueness, I don't know how to say that. There are semantic interoperability, which should be rich, but in between we've already reached technical interoperability. And the semantic interoperability is very far away. How do we organize this semantic interoperability? There are many...
Maybe we'll take some few questions if you don't mind, so to keep with the time schedule. I have another question for Etienne. Etienne Fister, the Chief Economist of the agency.
Yes, hello. When I look at the basic participative regulation that you mentioned, we may think of it like a general commitment procedure. In the sense that it is a commitment, and the commitment is a code of conduct, but it is not aimed at a single company, it is not even aimed at a single industry, it is aimed at all the strategic actors. You mentioned the fact that Google may be a strategic actor in some industry, but it may not be in another industry. You could actually have the same question. Will certain parts of a code of conduct be relevant for all the industries that you will be looking at? Or does the code of conduct will have to be adjusted industry by industry because the stakes are not the same, the advantage and the limits of that type of conduct may not be the same? And if there is a lot of variation between companies and then between industries, you fall back to a standard commitment procedure, which is adjusted to a single industry or company, or even few companies, because sometimes we have commitments which are addressing conducts by several companies in an industry.
Thank you. Patrick Hubert. On va peut-être attendre parce que comme c'est capté, comme ça on entendra la question.
I was wondering whether you are not afraid of the risk of capture of the regulator with all these, ex-ante negotiations and regulations. In this country, we have an experience that maybe I'm taking some risk by saying that publicly. The sectorial regulators, whose hundreds of civil servants are spending, endless time in cocktail parties and meetings with the regulator.
We never do that in competition.
They are not very efficient. And when a challenger really wants some harsh decision, they have a better time, complaining before the generalist competition authority than visiting these authorities. We spend too much time, that's my view, with the regulator.
Okay.
That's a controversial question. So Philip, you have 3 questions to answer.
Sure. Well, I'll try to answer them in the reverse order. So yes, we did consider the issue about capture, and we would hope that the digital markets unit in any country, no matter how it's set up, would not become some massive bureaucracy fed by lobbyists and champagne and things like that. I imagine it would be focused on expertise, data science, competition law, economics, and there would be a distance. But we're not imagining, at least in my mind, a massive bureaucracy that would create a new opportunity for lobbying and therefore capture. And we are maintaining a degree of cynicism in terms of the companies that come to us and want to help us understand what the code should look like, because inevitably this is a regulatory code we're suggesting, so it's our code. So we take the input from the complainants, who could be making strategic complaints. We take the input from the big platforms, who could be explaining their model and we understand it or we don't, or they could just be missing a few facts that we, because they know what the really bad stuff is and we don't see it. But eventually it's a government-led code, and that is something which you try out. I get criticism all the time.
They don't need to approve the code.
No, the entities? No, we wouldn't have them. We wouldn't give them a vote. We wouldn't expel them from the party. But we would vote. But importantly, the idea of the code is that at least to get the discussion going like that, and to get a learning about these practices, so we can actually understand it, because we don't think the heat of litigation and investigation is as fair as that seems, is the best way to identify these kinds of issues. And I get criticism all the time from people in other jurisdictions who say codes don't work, codes of conduct don't work, they're too soft. Or they're subject to capture. Okay, all right, that's that experience in those countries. What can we learn from those mistakes? Maybe the answer isn't a code. Maybe the answer is something else. But definitely this idea of participative discussion, I think, is the beginning of it. And I think that there's got to be some argument led that getting ahead of some of these problems can only happen through a code. Otherwise, you're waiting for the judges, and frankly, and I'm on record, 10, 12 years of a Google shopping investigation, multiple commitments, offers, and strategic lobbying happening there. This commitment is not good enough. This commitment is not good enough. And then you have a resolution, which frankly I think is not an effective resolution in that market, personally. And that's just something where, so you can't just rely only on antitrust in that situation, though there are opportunities for antitrust. Commitments, a general commitment model is indeed what we're probably trying to do. And there are areas where there's an opportunity then for it to focus on commitments in a smaller group, if need be, or the wider group, if need be. I do think that this kind of flexibility, I think, Etienne, you're suggesting, it reflects a recognition that in some sectors it might not be applicable, but equally, not all platforms are platforms. I mean, I'm always almost bored or frustrated, I don't know which, by the fact that people lump all these platforms together. There's communications platforms, there's commerce platforms, there's sales platforms. These platforms have different dynamics, and the code would have to reflect that, like that, and it would have to be evolved in that way, and to make it sure it's appropriate. On the point about interoperability, I'm absolutely with you that interoperability leads to competition, and we probably need to do more. I'm not a big fan of massive data release. I'm not a big fan of breaking up companies. So when I was at the CMA, we clearly had a clear political direction to break up certain finance platforms, okay, banks, clearly. And we did an investigation of these banks, And we found out that breaking them, or we decided that breaking them up wouldn't have created any solution in any way. It would just created a larger oligopoly with the same lazy practices. The banks were just sitting on consumer data and not using it to create new opportunities for existing customers. So they were ripping off the back book and offering benefits to the new customers, and then exploiting the back book. And so what we said was, let's not break them up. Let's open them up through interoperability and data portability. And the banks came to us, some of them, and said, "Oh, you want consumers to be more effective against us? Okay, we'll give each consumer a USB stick with all their financial data on it, and they can take the USB stick and go into another bank." And we were horrified. That's not interoperability, and I don't want a USB stick with all my financial data on it. And another bank came up and said, "We'll give every customer an iPad with all of their data on it, and then they can just walk into a competing bank and say, 'What can you offer me?'" We said, we don't want distribution of iPads. This is not a solution. We want interoperability so that financial intermediaries can access your data set, which you, big lazy bank, aren't doing anything with, and they can offer new tools and new choice tools and new products for consumers, so to help the consumers be more engaged with the bank. So people ask me all the time, what was your KPI for success? You didn't break up the banks, so what's your KPI for success? And we said, well, actually, our KPI isn't switching, getting people to move from one bank to another. It's not switching at all. I mean, we have strong evidence that British people switch their spouses more frequently than they switch their banks, right? So it's not switching. It's multi-banking, if I can say that. And so it's being more engaged with your bank and saying, I want more from you. Look what they are offering me. I'm going to switch. And you're going to see a disintermediation of financial products. And people will go one place for their mortgage, one place for something else, and this will be natural. And I think GS1 and others can be definitely pushing in that regard to help that kind of market develop. But we obviously need more regulation to open that up. But interoperability leads to competition. It's not the other way around.
Thank you. Maybe Henry, about the cloud?
Yeah, I was struck by you had this slide about the cloud, and I also remember reading one of your articles with nice pictures as well, where you were mentioning the competition risk that you see in the high concentration of the cloud industry, but also in that article you mentioned the kind of systemic risk that you see into it. So again, there's a link to how the financial markets function and the need for regulation facing systemic risk. But maybe you would want to expand a little bit on what you see in the cloud.
Sure, thank you. I mean, so the cloud, right, we don't see it, right, but we all use it. So the authority will be using it, the banks will be using it, the defense departments will be using it, and their business model is based on efficiency, the cloud business model, efficiency and resilience, of course, and security, right? My only question is, looking ahead, right, we've seen what concentration does in certain markets. We're not saying concentration itself is bad, but it can lead to other problems. And it's difficult to think of another industry that is more concentrated than cloud, and yet none of us know about it. None of us seem to care, because there's a range of benefits and efficiencies, all right, with this cloud stuff. So that's great, but do we really want to trust the cloud companies to assure us about the resilience? And you could say, yes, we trust them. And there's a degree of public procurement review and a degree of government standards, etc. But I don't know, I still think there is a risk of some form of competition problem coming forward, like we've seen in other industries of consolidation. And I think we need to get ahead of that and start thinking about that. And I think similar principles that we've been talking about today and competition law generally should be applying to the cloud as well. And this is why, okay? If in the global financial crisis, one or two banks fell over, okay, and the world goes nuts, okay? I understand that, all right? In the cloud, you've got, as I mentioned, the Pentagon has its data in the cloud, defense departments, multiple banks, lots of people have the data in the cloud. If one of those companies goes over, falls over for a day or an hour or something like that, despite the assurances that it'll never happen, and this is where I might not sound as reasonable as I've been sounding all morning, okay? If one of those companies falls over, it's not a global financial crisis. It's a zombie apocalypse, right? Zombie apocalypse, if one of those cloud companies goes over for a day, okay? And you might say, oh, there we go, he's exaggerating again, socialist intervention, No, it's just a reality, right? We are so dependent on that, and we don't even know. So all I'm saying is let's start thinking ahead about these kinds of issues, about this concentration we don't even know about, and what can we do about it to make sure we better understand that model. Maybe there's nothing to worry about at all all right? But that seems unlikely, given the kinds of concentration and problems we've seen in other markets.
I have a question going back to the idea of the code of conduct. The first one is among the discussions that will happen within the European Commission when it starts a new mandate. We have heard some proposals about new form of ex-ante regulation at the European level. So that may or may not impact the UK. We'll see at the end of October. Do you feel that both could be a right answer to the problem, or how do you compare both solutions in terms of having this code of conduct or having a sort of blanket regulation that might or might not apply to every company in terms of data access or data interoperability? And a second question is more on a practical level. We have heard different reports and thoughts about how to understand more closely within the companies how they operate their algorithm or their platforms. I'm thinking about a report that was written in France about understanding how Facebook and other platforms deal with hate speech, for example. And so there was a bunch of administration experts that went and discussed with Facebook and other companies to understand that. So in order to adopt a code of conduct, wouldn't you need some form of investigation powers to make sure that what the company says is exactly what is happening right there? So does that mean that this digital unit would necessarily be part of the competition authority? That's one question. So maybe to start with it, and then I'll open the floor for the last question.
Sure, thanks. So one answer is definitely I think there's a solution that requires a degree of regulation and a degree of competition law enforcement, definitely. I'm not a big fan of broad brush European regulation, takes 10 years to negotiate, is relatively watered down, and then is enforced nationally. I think we need to do something quicker than that. So I think that some of the solutions will be regional, some of them will be national. I think that whatever regulatory solution is proposed will only complement antitrust, and it needs to be surgical. So even though it might be relatively general, it has to be, tailored. It has to be bespoke to the particular problem at issue or the particular platform at issue. So there's that aspect to it. Definitely there would always have to be some sort of monitoring function within any digital team to assess whether or not the commitments and the code is being adhered to. That requires data science knowledge, the knowledge of essentially what many competition authorities, including the CMA, are acquiring already. And indeed the CMA has done amazing work already with its, I call them data wizards, not data scientists, but maybe I'm being too kind. But they are amazing what they can do, especially in the consumer protection space. So they've got a degree of artificial intelligence and algorithms that can identify fake reviews, various scams, that would take, these economists and lawyers with giant brains, hundreds of man hours or person hours to identify the same thing. So clearly there are ways the authorities can learn. I think that CMA and other authorities are learning first in the consumer protection space and using data science for that. Clearly you can use it for other models. And so one of the reasons why I can't answer whether the DMU that we're proposing will be in the CMA or somewhere else is that we actually had different views within our group about this. And the Treasury officials very cleverly suggested to us, leave that blank, right? So of course we've had some criticism. Why didn't you place the DMU? Like that. You should have placed it. It was a failed opportunity. You missed your opportunity. But the Treasury people, quite clever, these guys, they said, no, leave that blank, because then that keeps the debate going. Where will it be? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from telecommunications? Is it coming from CMA? Where does it come from? And then there's a budgetary fight because the budget is being allocated. Who wants the money? And so that keeps the issue discussed, the need for this, right? So it's quite tactical. I was interested.
Competition between agencies?
Competition amongst agencies, like that. And so, you can clearly see a role for the CMA, but I don't believe the answer is a virtual regulator with, say, 5 people from the agency, 5 people from communications, 5 people from the financial services, and they get together once a month to talk virtually about digital regulation. No. I mean, nothing will happen, right? And I don't think the answer necessarily is an online harms regulator with a little wing that talks about digital and competition. But if there is an online harms regulator, we need to have that digital knowledge in there to make sure that whatever regulations they come up with are surgical. So it's that aspect. So in a way, yes, we left it blank intentionally to keep the debate. It'll be different in different countries, and it may indeed be that your own digital development will decides, okay, we'll do this within the authority, or But you definitely have to be able to have access to these bigger beasts, these bigger ministries with these bigger powers, like that. You have to be able to get them to move in the same direction that you want them to.
Thank you. So I think we have 1 minute for last question or remark. No questions standing? No? Well, thanks a lot, Philippe, for being with us this morning, and really congratulations on the way you put your message across. It was very powerful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.